So, a very warm welcome to our SIETAR Europa webinar in hot summer. We have just exchanged with Ilyll, our presenter. She is based in Tel Aviv, so the temperatures over there are as high as in many countries in Europe. And I see that we have many participants from all over the world. You are very welcome to use the chat window to write down where your feet touch the ground currently. Maybe also to share the insane temperatures. I see people based in Canada, Finland, Vancouver, in Canada, in Egypt, in Croatia, Hamburg, Costa Rica, Germany, Budapest, Slovakia, Amsterdam. A very good evening from Egypt, so around the corner, Ilyll. Also from Poland, from Germany again, from the Netherlands, and a very warm welcome from Brest in France, Bonn in Germany, and yes, many people. Oh, from Atlanta, from Georgia. So we have a very intercultural audience as always. And we are very happy to greet you, Ilyll, today. I hope everyone is having really nice time, also summertime, and thank you for joining our webinar. Ilyll Sne-Or is the cross-cultural mediator who is going to talk about stories that work in cross-cultural mediation. Ilyll has lived in the USA, in France, in Spain. Also, he speaks several languages, not only Spain, Argentina, so you are also multilingual. Spanish, English, French, obviously, but also Arabic and Hebrew. And I'm very curious about your stories, also how you work with stories, and how we can also work with them. So also some inspirations for the audience. Currently, we have over 80 people and there are still people joining. So really fantastic number for the summer break. So you see that the theme awakes interest. And I'm handing over to you. Thank you, Ilyll, for being with us. And as we have said, you have a couple of questions in the meantime. So we would like to ask you again to use the chat window to answer those questions. And then when you have any questions regarding the presentation, regarding the cross-cultural mediation, you can also use the function of questions and answers. That would be fantastic. So, Ilyll, the stage is yours. Okay. I'm Joanna Zell. I'm happy to host you. Take care.
Thanks, and thanks a lot, Joanna, for the beautiful introduction and happy summer words. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I hope I covered most of the continents that you're calling in from, all of you. And welcome to this session. I'll try and make it as personal as I can to all of you. I know that we're getting close to, like 100 people, and yet it's important for me that each and every one of you will be able to benefit as much as possible from the content. So I will be asking all sorts of questions, and just like Joanna said, you're more than welcome to type that into the chat box. And if you also have questions more towards the end, so feel free also just to kind of note them as we go and then to ask them at the end, or to type them also in the chat, and Joanna will collect them. So welcome to Stories That Work on cross-cultural mediation. And I'd like to share with you something that my mother always told me. And she said that you always have the first option, and then you have the second option, and then you have the option that you haven't yet thought of. So I really hope that the time we have today will kind of slowly create the path of that option that you haven't yet thought of, which will be very cross-cultural, and it will be also building a bridge, and it will also be dealing with stories, as you also know. a technical thing, I encourage you, I assume that some of you already have like a pen and paper next to you. But if you don't, so you're invited to go and grab one just because it will come in handy. And also throughout the time we have together, I'll be weaving in all sorts of like questions and exercises that you'll have a chance to kind of do on the spot, and obviously in your free time go back and complete later. So pen and paper, that's yeah, that will come in handy. Okay, so from here I'd like to share a quote that I like. It's actually a proverb, a Native American one, and it goes like this. All right. I'll read it out loud and then kind of we'll discuss it. Okay, so tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. I usually like reading quotes twice, so I'll read it again. You can also take a second to review it as I do it. Tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. Okay. What do you understand from that about stories? And you're invited now to kind of write that in the chat box. Also from this Native American proverb, and also from like the different fields and experience that you come from. How do you understand it? What does it kind of make you think or feel?
So we've got the first answers. The first
Great.
association is the emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
Power of stories to create worldview. We thrive, coherence, and stories guide us in life. The story touches the heart. Stories are reported experiences, are better to remember, get us in another section of our brain. And it's about the personal experience. Stories closer to the heart again, invites us to make our own meaning based on our own story, and that stories are felt and related to. Stories such as legends, context is crucial, and they invoke emotions and we can often find our place in it. So we have also some personal comments, as I use intensive storytelling anecdotes during my trainings, for example, and also that stories reflects storytellers' reality.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Joanna, for collecting all of the information. And I think that all of what you said and wrote is very, very crucial. I'll even add to that another thing. You have here basically the facts, right? You have a truth. And then you have the story that as if has already a life of its own, and in a sense kind of weaves all these things together. And I think that it's crucial for our session now to even kind of to think about the anatomy of connection, the anatomy of communication, and also the different components, what these things are composed of, how do these different components work together, and how, just like also some of you wrote, and another person that said that you also weave and use stories in some kind of extensive use also in your trainings, because there is something that works in stories, okay? So soon we'll get to that and why do stories work. But before we get to that, I'd like to share what is planned for today. So we'll dive immediately into another little exercise, just like I said. I'll share a little bit more about myself, and then you'll have a few seconds to experience one of the things that I use a lot in my coaching sessions and trainings as well. And then it will be like 3 parts of a braid. The first one is going to be a kind of the line of stories. What are stories? How do they work? And why are they important to you as cross-culturalists, as interculturalists, as practitioners, as researchers, and just as curious humans? Otherwise you wouldn't have been here during your summer vacation probably. And then the second thread is going to be culture. How I define culture, why culture matters, and what happens actually when different cultures meet. What does it look like and what can you do about it? And the third thread is going to be conflict, also conflict evolution, also solutions, and also resolution. So we have a lot of same rhyme for the words of conflict. And then the last part is actually going to be weaving together, almost like a braid, these 3 different threads as if parallel lines that in physics and math maybe don't meet, but in our case, they are going to meet. And trying to see how can you actually put together, also in your trainings and also in your research and also maybe in your personal life, how can you best mediate across cultures with using stories. So from here, I can share that when I started thinking, and I think it's something that all of you are required to do every once in a while, to think like, hey, who are you, right? Why do you do what you do? Why did you choose a certain profession? Why do you live in the place in which you live? Many different things come up. I'll share with you some of the things that came up to me. So for instance, I felt that I invented my profession as a cross-culturalist just because I was born in Israel, raised in the States, and later lived and worked and studied in France and in Spain and Argentina. And I've been traveling around and I work in 5 languages, like Joanna said. And actually part of the more I kind of dove deeper into cross-culturalism, I understood that I ought to also learn maybe mediation. Soon you'll hear why. And as you can continue seeing these different titles that I wrote, it made me notice that the way in which I communicate to myself, who I am, what is my story, changes also over time, and also obviously according to the circumstances where I am, what I do. And I now invite you to grab your pen and paper just so that you'll have some hands-on experience, and like a little asterisk for all the trainers here. This is something I often do also in trainings. And I'd encourage you now, just like the image over here, with a hand on your heart, to be honest with yourself for a few seconds and to ask yourself, who are you? Okay? It doesn't have to be a 1 through 5 list. It can be a word cloud. It can be sentences. Take a few seconds to write whatever comes. And as you start writing, try to also see if you have different thoughts and feelings that these different components of your identity bring. For those of you that will want to share some of what you're writing, so that's great. The moment you're done, just put it in the chat box, and Joanna will help us on that. So go ahead.
Just a request. Thank you very much, Ilyll. When
Sure.
you write things in the chat box, please use the function to all the participants, so that it's not only the messages I get, or Ilyll, Linda, and me, but also everyone can see them.
Okay, do we have any replies in the chat?
Yes, we do. We have
Okay.
2 women actually who are
Okay.
writing, I'm a human, woman, mother, teacher, individual, and thinker.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got also educator, mother, lover of peace, naturalist, gatherer of information, executive coach, learner, executive coach, once again, wife and cross-cultural trainer. Then we've got also interculturalist, mother, French speaker, woman, professional, and 1 man, learning experience designer, intercultural facilitator, singer and guitarist, storyteller in song and teaching. So right now we can also have a competition, a contest, guess who is behind. Yeah,
Okay, great.
interculturalist, adventurer, lifelong learner, critical thinker, and space exploration enthusiast. We've got also much more answers. Thank you very, very much for all the answers. Fascinating how, we deal with identities and what stories we tell about ourselves. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's also exactly, thanks to all of you for sharing, and Joanna for kind of sharing the answers of all of you. And the reason that I use this exercise almost in every training and every coaching session, of course on a one-on-one, but also in team trainings, is that anything I think that we as humans want to improve in that involves other people, and also if you work in the most kind of, if you write code or you think that your job maybe doesn't involve so much people, and even more so, more relevant for people who work with people like most of you, I assume, it's very important to start noticing what are those inner paths that you communicate with yourself. How do you view your inner diversity? What are the different parts and those different components of your own identity that sometimes clash, and sometimes you feel that you need to mediate. Perhaps they clash because of the society or the place or the culture you live in, or perhaps that's just something that you bring with you. And I think that it's very, very important to kind of be as familiar as possible and as much as acquainted with that kind of inner communication that you have. It's almost as if, being a mediator and working as interculturalists and cross-culturalists, we build bridges, okay? And it's kind of saying if an engineer wants to build a strong bridge that will last, that will really be able to connect at least two sides, so you need to know with which bricks you're using, okay? What are the materials that you construct with? And that applies also to mediators and also to trainers, right? The more you know yourself, the more flexible and the more skills and opportunities you'll have to offer your trainees as well. So this is like another note, and you're invited to use this exercise. It seems very simple, right? Just one little question, and yet you could also see from the variety and the colors of the different responses that we had, that it takes time and that it goes, you can really dive very deep with that. Okay, so from here, thanks again for sharing, to all of you who shared. And I'd like to continue at this point and to shift to the first thread, which is stories. Try to think, which story comes to mind? Which stories do you like? You can just type in like the first story that comes to your mind. Joanna, you can share whatever comes.
Yes, sure, with real pleasure. So the first answers appear immediately. Fairy tales,
Right.
also about sense of life, any kind of biography, Bible, Emperor's New Clothes. So we are getting very specific.
Specific, good.
Anecdotes, legends, Red Riding Hood,
Uh-huh.
The Hungry Caterpillar, The Little Prince, biographies again, films. Oh, my father's stories. So we've got a rich fan
diversity
of
of
answers. Yeah.
Great. And I think that that's exactly the thing, that there's something in stories that's very, very intuitive. And all these different stories that you mentioned, from more biography and maybe academic or like a research oriented type of story, to stories that are children books, right? Like Little Red Riding Hood and The Hungry Caterpillar, that I assume these stories are known today to almost any culture, or to many, many cultures across the globe. Why are stories so powerful? What do stories encompass? What do they have inside them? So, stories encompass, first of all, beliefs, right? You have some kind of system of belief, or you could have some religion, or you could even have some kind of inner logic or reasoning for life. I can give you an example that as a little girl, there was a story that I loved. It was called The Legend of the Bluebonnet. And over there, it told about a tribe that lived in a beautiful, prosperous land. And then one year there was a drought and there wasn't rain. And what do? So you need to sacrifice something. And then there's a whole procedure that starts, okay? And the story continues from there. Within just that very beginning of the story, you can already see that you have beliefs of an individual, of a group, of a culture okay? That kind of starts from the very high. And then you start going down into the thoughts and into the mind of individuals, right? What are the biases that people have? What are the stereotypes? What is the knowledge that people kind of have, maybe believe in, right? What are the things that they already come with? And the feelings are also something that stories capture in a very, very effective way. What do people feel? And that includes their deepest desires, their emotions, sometimes even like the emotions can be also like traumas sometimes, also excellent memories that they have. And these thoughts and feelings are very, very important. I can give you for a minute, I'm jumping out of the fairy tale land for a minute just to connect it also to current, maybe the current world, I'd say. And I can share that from here, from the region, or even more specifically from the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you really want to go to that point zero of narratives and of stories and tap into the thoughts and feelings, so most people, and that will also take some time to discover, actually talk about 1948 as a crucial year. It's not mentioned so much in current politics, and that's why maybe there still is the current reality that there is over here, and we'll talk about that a little later. You'll hear about it more. But I discovered that talking about 1948 is crucial because of the split in narratives, okay? So you have one narrative that will say in 1948, what happened was that the state of Israel was founded. For some, that will be the happiest day on earth. That will be the War of Independence, okay? You have here a different name for the same event, okay? And yet for another nation, for other people, for the Palestinians, that will be the Nakba, okay? Which is the most horrific and disastrous day, the loss of everything, okay? That's a trauma, like not only a personal one, but also a collective one, okay? And if you want to read about it, it'll be hard to find, I think, articles that really touch on the depth of that. You need to go to literature and to stories. And over there, you really get that cloud, also of the beliefs and also of the thoughts and of the feelings that have to do with that event, all right? So we'll go back to that later, but just bear that in mind. Another thing that stories obviously encompass are actions, right? What do people do at the end? What did that little girl in the Legend of the Blue Bonnet choose to do with the fact that there was a drought, that she didn't have what to eat? What does Little Red Riding Hood do when her grandmother is sick and she wants to see her and give her food, okay? So strategies, ways of doing things, these are also part of stories. And you have an individual or group cultural profile, okay? Which kind of, I use the term cultural profile, and I also invite you to use it. I don't think there's one training or session or coaching session that I facilitate without using the term cultural profile, because it's very useful in a sense that it represents the mixture of all the points above. What does a person believe in? What is the hierarchy of values that they live according to? What do they feel about themselves, about others, okay? And how do they act, okay? So the cultural profile, you'll hear more about that a little later, but this is just for now, the beginning, okay, of what are stories made of. Now, what is the power of stories? And for discussing further the power of stories, before the power of stories, we'll get to what are stories made of. And stories are made, besides what you've heard now about this kind of top to bottom beliefs and actions and thoughts, you always have characters, right? They can be people, they can be animals, they can be a table and a chair that are discussing, and then you'll have an entire story that starts from there. And then you'll have some interaction in between them. Okay, so if you're thinking about Little Red Riding Hood, so she has an interaction maybe with her grandmother because she's sick, and then some interaction, for instance, with the wolf. And then you have a conflict, you have a problem. And that can be a trigger and that can be an opportunity. Okay, you can already kind of write for yourself a mental note. A conflict has very bad PR, and yet conflicts can be transformed. And this is going to be the beginning of the end. How do you transform conflict into more effective communication and bridge building and mediation? But already here, you can start noticing that. And then usually in stories, you have some kind of a journey, right? Little Red Riding Hood goes into the forest. She goes out of her comfort zone. Mulan, for example, she decides to leave her parents' home to get dressed as if she's a man and to join the army, okay? And in almost every story, and this is some kind of equation that crosses cultures and times, and you can really dissect almost every story and get to these different components, has these different parts, okay? And at the very end, you also have some transformation. You have the development of the character, and you have some kind of prize, something that people really gain by the end of all of what they've gone through, okay? It's like the pain versus the gain, right? And it's important, it's like a balance. And in stories, usually the gain will be much bigger and much higher. So that's also important to just bear in mind. And going back to the question I asked you before, so what is the power of stories? And I'll share here another quote that I like, which is another Native American proverb that says that the one who tells stories rules the world. And think about it. Think about who are the people that you encounter and you remember, who are maybe leaders or politicians or people that have influenced you in your life. Who do you want to be as trainers for your teams, for your students, even within your closer community or family, right? You want to be people that will be able to touch, to impact. And many times stories, just like I'm going back to the quote of the very beginning, discussing facts and discussing truth, stories are, I think, probably the most, or one of the most efficient tools for being able to master all of that and to really connecting to other people. Okay, so continuing from here, we'll leave stories a little bit and shift to something else, to a different topic and to a different thread, and that's culture. So I'd like to ask you, and Joanna, I'll need your help here again, if this image represents in any sense your understanding of what is culture. What do you see in it?
So again, we would like to encourage you to use the chat window.
Yes,
and
please.
Here we've got the first answers: patterns and groups.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, it's a beautiful picture.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. The universe.
Uh-huh.
Different shades, flexible piles of sand, movement, bodies of thoughts, similarities and differences, narratives, no connection with each other, islands, shades of the same color that are intertwined, differences and similarities, diversity, petri dish, separate islands, individualism, silk and beauty, flow, dynamics, distance and connection.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks to all of you for sharing, and Joanna for bringing that in. Yeah, I'm glad that this is relatable to you. And another note, a very practical one. I use imagery a lot in my trainings. I find it extremely beneficial and effective. Just pay attention even to you, to how maybe easy it is for most people to relate even to some abstract art, and through that discover or kind of make sense of things that are very abstract, even like culture or like philosophical things. So that's another note that you can really be creative with the images that you use. And I find that it's extremely powerful as well, and very, very effective. And closing these parentheses, more methodologic ones, and going back to culture. So what is culture? Yes, I'm very glad that you could see in culture, in this image, a lot of what resonates for you as culture. And I can share that after many years of working cross-culturally and with diverse people from different continents and different industries, I've come to the conclusion that culture is a human operating system. And what do I mean by that? Try to think for a minute if you've ever experienced using, for instance, a PC and then moving to a Mac computer, or having an iPhone and then moving to like an Android Samsung operating system. How does that feel? Usually, most people would say that it feels very uncomfortable, and that for doing the same thing, like checking the weather, or even writing an email, or taking a picture and then editing it, or cropping it, or uploading it, the way in which you do it is completely different. And I think that exactly this inconvenience and this discomfort and that need to learn a new path for doing the same thing that you've already done before and that you knew how to do before, that's exactly what happens across cultures. And don't get me wrong, when I say culture, I don't necessarily mean a national culture, okay? Just thinking about all of you, the more than 100 people that we have here. Also, if I'd say, okay, a German culture, an American culture, even Israel, that is a teeny tiny little country, if I'd say an Israeli culture, there's no such thing, because you have dozens of cultures, right? Within Germany, within India, within South Africa, within even Bhutan, like the one of the smallest countries in the world, okay? So it's very important to bear in mind that culture, when I define culture as a human operating system, it's also a different corporate culture. I'm working on a huge project with Amazon, and I can see that even working with the different tech teams that tackle the same technical problems, within these different teams, you sometimes have a completely different corporate professional culture. Okay, sometimes even siblings in the same family, two sisters, two brothers, brother and sister, can have at the end of the day two very different cultural profiles and two very different cultural operating systems. Okay, so one of these components of culture is definitely also the language you think in, the values, and we'll get to that in a minute, that you kind of prioritize in a high place. But that the issue of culture being something that really defines the individual and operates as an operating system, that's the major thing. And culture, just like you can see here, according to my experience and belief, is that it composes what are the images you have of yourself and of others, what are the biases, right? How do you feel about anything, right? How do you do anything? What are the stereotypes you might have? What is the body of knowledge that you come with? And another tricky thing about cultures, and it's a little bit like in this image over here, or going back to maybe one of the kind of more renowned images of culture, it's to look at culture as some iceberg. That what you see at the very tip, I tend to relate to it as the actions. You can see how people say hi and say bye, or make coffee, or relate to a deadline, right? What is their concept of time? So you see the action, but you don't see all of that heavy machinery, all of that infrastructure, all of those wheels that are turning and churning and actually make them do what they do in the way they do, okay? That is invisible. And you really need to be a very, I'd say even brave scuba diver to dive into these deep icy waters of that cultural logic for being able to understand what is that other human operating system that you're encountering, okay? Or you'll need to ask questions. You'll need to go the extra mile for doing that. And another tricky thing about cultures, again, also on the most individual level, but of course also on a corporate level and also on a national and also global level, culture changes all the time. I also use that a lot in my trainings. If I were to ask each and every one of you, what is your cultural profile today versus what it was last year, or 5 years ago, or how it will be in 10 years? It won't be the same, right? Because we change. You have these different impacts and influences that change all the time, and cultures evolve. They're like a living organism, okay? So this was a little bit about cultures in general, maybe what they kind of, how they function and operate. And yet there are some things that all cultures have in common. So the first thing, I kind of like to call it the superiority bias. If I were to ask you, what culture makes the most sense to you in the world? You'd probably say your own, okay? That's the most, or even if you kind of do the cherry pick type of cultural profile, being eclectic, saying, well, you know, I take a little bit from the Mexican culture and from the Japanese culture and from American culture, and this is, okay, so that would still be your own culture, and you would probably, because you choose to live according to that, you would find it the most logical, okay, the very best. At the end of the presentation, there will also be a link to an article that I wrote about that, so you'll be invited to read that. And for those of you that like also visual resources, I many times use maps, and it's fascinating I love maps. And if you research maps of different empires from different places around the world, from different periods of time, you'll see that usually the place that is located in the center of the map will be the culture that created the map. So either their religious or sacred place will be in the center of the map, like Jerusalem over here in the region, Cusco of Peru for the Inca, okay, empire in South America, etc. But even just opening like textbooks and seeing what is the center of the world for children who study geography in the United States versus in France versus in Congo, you'll be surprised to see the differences, okay? And going back to what every culture does, again, they define within this operating system of what is right and what is wrong and what is good and what is bad, what is gender, what is hierarchy, what is time, right? Everything. You also define what is the I. Is there a word for saying I? There are cultures that technically it's hard even to say I, okay? Or what is the other? And the middle point is extremely important. That is something that I use a lot because think about it that at the end of the day, humans are humans, right? Across any part of the globe. And any human will experience shame and fear and disgust and honor, right? But the thing is that the hierarchy of these different values, that's what changes. Do you live in a culture, or is it a cultural profile where you live for working, or the other way around? You work for a living, okay? Is saving face the most important thing, and then maybe joy is the last, or the other way around? Okay, so just bear that in mind as crucial things about cultures. Now, what happens when cultures meet? You can imagine cultures like two waves in the sea, and unfortunately, from my experience, the default of what happens when two cultures meet is this, okay? It's this big conflict. That led me to my master's in mediation, okay? It can look a little bit like this, or using again an image that I like to use. You can look at it this way. And why are conflicts so relevant to us all, especially in these days? So first of all, conflicts are super relevant because they're created, they can stem, they have the potential of starting from any human interaction. And that could require looking in, right? That kind of is a mirror to you. Hey, what does it mean about me? Who am I? And that can be very uncomfortable as well, okay? Now, in these days of super hyper individuality of the 21st century, I think there are even more and more conflicts, because the more you live in a community, in a segregated community, and it's very clear within your own culture how to go about problems, how to solve them, right? You could go to maybe the religious leader for one thing, you could go to the social leader for one thing, to the guild or to the professional leader for something else. When you live alone, that's maybe the conflict is maybe the other side of freedom, okay? And you're supposed to know how to manage conflicts with colleagues, with bosses, or for some self-employed, maybe with bureaucracy, with partners, with friends, with children, with neighbors. And every time, it's not as if there are classes on conflict resolution exactly at school. And I think that in a sense, also the weakening of old borders, right? The fact that until COVID days or Corona days, you could just take a plane and cross the world and be there in just a few hours. That actually puts much more pressure on what happens when two individuals from different cultural profiles meet, okay? These individual gaps become bigger and more crucial. And of course, living in VUCA times, that stands for volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, many times the result, okay, and many times the direct or the default result is conflict. So that's not very good news. And yet, I can ask you, hey, but just like I said before, conflict many times has very bad public relations, okay? And perhaps conflict could also have good sides, right? And what could be the benefits of conflict? So first of all, using conflict, and that is something that if you want to connect it to many of the global leaders today that you can see, using conflicts for for leadership offers some kind of purpose. It also gives logic and some reasoning for very hard life circumstances. And it gives people a sense of security and belonging. I can tell you that over here in the region, with the current leadership that you have, for instance, in Israel, for many, many years, okay, there are many things that are being justified to the public just because you live in a conflict, okay? So people do sometimes very extreme or strange or bizarre or surprising things just because someone is feeding them all the time that they have to, because they're in a conflict, okay? And that actually almost creates like a refuge or like a safe place and a place to anchor these emotions or this kind of cognitive understanding or biases of what you know or what you think or what you expect from the world. For instance, every time or many times when there's some offer for like a peace treaty, so then people will say afterwards, and it doesn't work. So then we'll say, oh yeah, because we knew to begin with that there's no partner, there's no one to talk with from the other side, okay? It doesn't mean that that's the reality. It just means that they find refuge in conflict for anchoring their own emotions and biases, all right? Which is very, very powerful. And of course, conflicts also create some dichotomy, right? So it kind of shifts the world into right and wrong, and that is much easier to contain than complexity. And not only that, conflicts can really be like fillers, that they serve as alternatives to integration, to diversity, okay, to seeing, to recognizing pain of oneself, of one group, and also of others, and also to focus on the needs, okay? And I think that these things are very, very important and are reflected by something quite unbelievable, which is taken from the Google project of seeing how often are words used over time. And you can just see how often the word conflict has been being used over the last 200 years and where it kind of increases dramatically. So if I'm starting to connect these two threads or the three threads that you've been hearing about until now, right? Stories and culture and conflict, and saying, you know, bad news, the default of two cultures meeting is conflict, okay? And you have stories. How can you mediate all of this? And not only mediate, but also foster trust, responsibility, accountability, and respect, also for oneself and also for others. So what I'm going to do now is actually to show you quite a complex slide. You've seen already all the information on it, but I just like you to kind of see stories, cultures, and conflicts all together. So it looks like this. Now, just like I said, you've already heard about these different points separately, okay? So now this is definitely the first time that you can see it together. And I put it here because I just like you to notice that what you have here is actually this different flow, okay? That you have like from the top to the bottom, you have the beliefs in stories and you have the human operating system, which is again, this meta perspective, okay? In cultures and in conflict, you also have the sense of maybe security and belonging that also is active, okay? And I think it's just important to bear in mind that stories, cultures, and conflict also have a lot in common, okay? And many things that kind of really encompass the entire human being and all walks of life and all aspects of life, almost like the inner anatomy of human existence. Exactly yesterday I had some coaching session with another like manager at Amazon who was in charge of a very big team, and it was a session on diversity management. And he said that, and he defined himself as a very spiritual North American man. And he said that what really bothers him, or like he doesn't know exactly how to go about this gap. He saw it as a gap between diversity and between spiritual unity, okay? Try to see how you would have answered such a question, maybe while looking at these three different columns of stories and cultures and conflict. And here we're starting to get into the tools. How can you actually start to use stories for bridging these cultural gaps and avoiding this default conflict, but rather doing this, building a bridge and creating a new shared story. So stories that mediate have to have, by definition, these different elements that you've been hearing about already in the time that we have together, which are the beliefs, okay, of both sides, of both parties, both cultural profiles, their thoughts and feelings, also their actions. What are they going to do the minute they get out of the meeting? Or how will they start seeing the world in a different way from that present moment? And perhaps also amending and changing a little bit a certain cultural profile. That's what the CP stands for, okay? Should be, yeah. So that is that. Now, how can you start doing that? First of all, communicate your intentions, okay? So connecting, and these steps are extremely important and crucial from my experience. So first of all, connecting, expand the common ground. Many times also when two cultures meet and they're about to enter this misunderstanding, the loss in time, energy, frustration, you can stop from it and say, hey, what do we have in common, right? Are these two colleagues that want to solve a problem? Are these neighbors? Is this a couple getting divorced that perhaps their common ground are their children, okay? Two VPs that are splitting the company. One wants to buy the shares of the other. Both of them want that the company will continue to thrive, right? They have that in common. Work with that. Reframe the picture, okay? Challenge the narratives of each one of them and also the perspectives. And from that, start to retell a new story. Many times sentences that start with, in my culture, da-da-dum, okay? That could come in handy. And to actually start, like to sit in the same situation and to use that situation as a starting point for that new shared story. Now, the more you can weave inside the story inclusion and accountability and also responsibility, right? That can be very important. Not saying, okay, because he did that, I feel that way. Or because she, no. To actually take the responsibility and through that to start constructing the story. Now, if you manage also using curiosity also as like mediators and people that are trainers, but also if you want to use it for yourself for conflictual situations, adding curiosity even as a question, also if you feel very stuck in saying, look, we're both here, we want to solve this problem, it's not going as easily as possible or as I would have liked to, and I see that you have a really different way of going about the same thing that I think about differently, and I'd love to know why. Okay, curiosity works and it works amazingly, but it has to be real. You can't fake it. All right, and humor, just like I wrote there, is very tricky, but if you manage to use humor in this very tense situation, that can also make a very, very big difference. Okay, now that's a lot, okay? These 6 steps maybe are just kind of, they sit comfortably inside one slide, and yet when you transform them into practice, they're crucial and they're complex steps. And the next slide that I'd like to share with you is a little kind of barometer, okay, for testing how sustainable is the new story that you created, and that can also be very helpful. So you try to create a new impactful story in a conflictual situation that has very active cultural components by creating a story that defines carefully who are the protagonists, okay? If you mentioned at the beginning stories like The Hungry Caterpillar and Little Red Riding Hood, it's important to define in this story who are the stakeholders. In this case, you can call them protagonists. Who is it about, okay? And try to separate the protagonists from the problem, because they are not the problem. That the problem is part of their story, but the moment you separate them, it creates space, and in that space you can start to weave that new story. Now, specifying the boundaries and also mapping where difficulties may be is extremely important, because that also taps into the strategy, okay, of how you think of going about things, how you want to change your perspective. And through that, it's also good and easy to focus on the shared interests and needs rather than positions, because in positions, it's something like you possess, okay? But if you focus on the needs and on the interests, you have, again, much more place to expand the common ground. Now, as much as you can in the process, also express appreciation also towards this hard work of the stakeholders, the two sides, two colleagues, a couple that's getting divorced, it doesn't matter. And weave in some kind of encouragements and positivity that becomes also very, very beneficial. And also try to kind of eliminate the action or reaction discourse, just like I mentioned a little bit before, by actually inserting that exercise that you experienced at the beginning, okay? Of who are you? That internal gaze, personal internal gaze, and through that encounter with yourself, how do you encounter others? And how do these two other people encounter themselves? How do they imagine themselves? And how do they encounter? And last but not least, try to kind of bear in mind, almost like a cloud above this new mediating story, the trial or the desire to embrace otherness and to create inclusion and belonging. So we're towards the end. Time is going by very, very quickly. And I know that this has been a lot in a very short period of time. I hope you had enough time to take notes and to kind of soak in all of these things. There are some recommendations that I'll show you in a minute, but we have a few more minutes for questions. So if there are questions, you're invited to write them now, and I'll start the end through that. So Joanna, I assume I'll need your help on that as well. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very, very cordially. We have one comment actually. I love the idea of shared storytelling in conflicts, but I wonder what it look like in practice. Maybe you could give us a practitioner's example.
Okay. I'm wondering how to answer that because it's a general question and there are many ways to answer it. The shared story, I can give like an example of colleagues working together. The creating a shared story can even be about two different people that need to work together and have different communication styles, have different understanding of time. Many times there's a lot of frustration and conflict that stems from how do people relate to a deadline? How do people relate to the time of starting a meeting? Do you show up on time or half an hour later? Okay. And many times creating a shared story could do something with, okay, we are working now together, all right? Our goals are to work effectively together, to succeed in this project, to be promoted, okay, to maybe win some recognition and maybe also something of the company. And while we do that, and many times just kind of rephrasing the situation by some of the tools that I mentioned before, by connecting and retelling and reframing can be very, very, very beneficial. I hope I answered the question. Okay.
Yes. Oh, yes. Bernd says thanks. So we have
Pleasure.
one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recommend some sources, books, articles, mentioning such mediating stories?
Yes. So here we go to the next one. So book-wise, there's William Yuri. William Yuri is probably one of the most renowned people that has been researching mediation and negotiation. He's especially renowned for negotiation. His first book that became an international bestseller is called Getting to Yes, that he wrote with Fisher, that was his advisor. I find actually Getting to Yes is a good book, but I recommend out of all his books, I think he should have about like 5 or 6 now, perhaps even more, the last one, which is called Getting to Yes with Yourself and Other Worthy Opponents. So that's one reading recommendation. I see again negotiation only as one form of communication. Obviously that can involve also tense and intense cross-cultural conflicts and situations that have very active cultural components, okay? Another TED Talk that I would recommend of The Danger of a Single Story. I think it's very eye-opening and it's just great. So you're invited to look at that. In the article over here, The Power of the Story, you have more of like the research side of which parts of the brain do stories affect and which neurons and which kind of paths within the brain do stories awaken, and through that how you can work, okay? So that is that. And the last two, these are little articles that I wrote on my website, and you're invited also to check them out and to see also about the compass of shame and also the compass of compassion when you mediate and tell stories across cultures, or rather use stories as building bridges across cultures. And of course, for any of you that have more specific questions, or like that one, because to talk in less than an hour about also stories and also culture and also conflict and also the combination of everything, and also wrapping it in with like practical steps, that's a lot. So you have over here also my website and also my email. So you're invited, more than invited, to send me an email or to also connect over LinkedIn. And I'll be really happy to send you specific recommendations for different readings and different, yeah, anything that would come to mind that you would like. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very, very much. We have one more question, actually. I mean, we have many more questions, but I would like to ask you to contact Ilyll via email. You see right now her contact. Also, the request for the slides. So, you know, if you feel like sharing the slides, there were some requests, and I asked the people to write you the email directly. And there is one more question I would like to ask you as the very last question.
Sure.
Really fascinating one. I'm reminded of the stories we tell ourselves. Part of conflict can arise from internal story. Does the model described here apply to reshaping internal stories?
Yeah, I think I understand, Joanna, why you chose this question. I can share that I understood at a certain point that the reason that I actually went to acquire my master's in mediation and conflict resolution, it dawned on me one day in one of the classes many years ago, was first of all, for being able to mediate my own internal conflicts. And as I said at the beginning, as any practitioner, I think, or trainee, or someone that wants to obviously facilitate and help other people improve their communication skills, their mediation skills, their cross-cultural skills, it always holds some kind of mirror, okay? Like any relationship will always reflect to you some of yourself. And I think that the more you as a practitioner, as a trainer, as a professor, as a researcher, and just as any human will be more familiar with your internal conflicts, with those different components that kind of inspire you, that ignite you, that you react to, okay? We didn't get into the physiology of conflict, into the involvement of the body also in that, like stories also do it, okay? So the more you're acquainted with that, the easier it will be later to also mediate externally, okay, to train externally. So I think that you always have here a trade-off, but it's as if like the more you scuba dive inside yourself, the easier it will be to scuba dive externally in the world. I hope that that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ilyll. It was extremely insightful. You are a born storyteller. And it's such a pleasure to listen to you. We could listen to you for hours and hours. Unfortunately, the time is up. You are the real magician. So this 1 hour has passed like 1 minute. Thank you very, very much for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your charming way of talking about how to work with stories. And we have plenty of thank you right now and plenty of comments of appreciation. Wonderful and refreshing. Actually, I would like to draw your attention to 3 more very important facts. Not stories, but facts this time. We have attracted more than 100 participants, and I would like to ask you to fill in the feedback right now. So we've got the the mirror of the atmosphere in the webinar, and a very, very warm welcome, not welcome, but thank you to our co-host Linda Winiak, who made sure that everything worked like a dream during this 1 hour. Thank you, Linda, for being, as always, a fantastic co-host. And the third, very important one, in 1 month and 3 days, we are meeting again at 6 o'clock. So please save the date at 6 o'clock p.m. Central European Time on the 15th of September, with the burning theme really directly in front of the presidential election in the US. Melissa Hahn is going to talk about US cultural values and the 2020 presidential elections. So you are very welcome to join our webinar in 1 month and 3 days. And with this in mind, with the stories of power and power of stories, not only in this context, but also in the context Ilyll has just beautifully described in her webinar, I would like to wish all of you a wonderful time, wonderful summer break for those of you who have time off. For those of you who are working, please don't get distracted by the heat. Enjoy working in general and working with stories in particular. Thank you, Ilyll. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Joanna. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.